where is anxiety in the brain? Where does it start? How is it created? There's two parts of the brain, luckily, that only two, luckily, not all kinds of parts that are going to be the focus that are going to help us. One is the cortex. And if you notice here, the cortex is all these four different lobes, and they have a left and a right side. You know, the cortex has, so we have left frontal lobe, right frontal lobe, left parietal lobe, right parietal lobe. This cortex, this curved part, and it's really not colored like this. They're just, it's pretty gray. And it's not solid. It's got has very different consistencies in different parts. Some are tougher than others. Some are really liquidy. But that's our cortex. Okay, so understanding the cortex, and that's often what people are talking about when they refer to the brain. They mean the cortex. They're often not talking about a lot of the underlying parts that are, you know, in the pons and the cerebrum, the medulla oblongata. Not really important for us to talk about with our clients. But we do want to talk about this really tiny little part that is on both the left side and the right side. You have two amygdalas that are in the brain. And those tiny parts, about the size of an almond in the brain, that part of the brain is also very involved in the production of anxiety, fear, stress, those kind of things, a panic. And the amygdala there is deep down inside the brain. And we'll go back to that. So I'd like to ask you to remember not just the cortex and the amygdala, but one other part. And this other part I want you to understand is something in the center of our brain that is shaped like a walnut, about the size of a walnut, maybe a little more oblong than a walnut is, but it's called the thalamus. And the thalamus is an important part of the brain for you to understand, because that's where all of our sensory experiences go to in order to be directed to different parts of our brain for processing. So those three things, cortex, amygdala, thalamus, is what I'd like you to take away from this slide. Okay. So there's two pathways to anxiety in the brain. One we're going to call the amygdala pathway, and one we're going to call the cortex pathway. But I want to say both pathways are going to include the amygdala, because you can't have anxiety, fear, panic without the amygdala. So the amygdala is part of both of these pathways, but one pathway does not include the cortex, and one pathway does include the cortex. Now, both of these pathways are going to start from sensory information that's coming in. Now, what I'd like to do is, even though this information is written out for you on the slide, I don't necessarily need this information to tell you this, but you have it here. But what I'd like you to do is, it helps if you have a visual of these two pathways to anxiety. So you have that information. I'm going to talk you through it, but don't feel like you necessarily have to take notes here or anything, because it's written out. But both of these pathways are going to start with sensory information coming in, what you see and what you hear. So information about what you see, of course, comes in through your eyes, and information about what you hear is coming in from hearing my voice, coming in through your ears. The eardrum is being vibrated, and there's, you know, all those little parts which we don't have to go. But what I'm trying to say is that when you're feeling something, like if you're holding a pen, or if you are feeling something like you're scratching your head and you're feeling your fingernails scratching against your skull, that is sensory information coming in. So I need you to understand all of that sensory information, wherever it's coming from your eyes, from your spinal cord, if we're talking about like your butt feeling sitting in the chair right now, you know, all of that information, when it comes in through our sensory pathways, whether the eye, the ear, or up your spinal cord, it goes first to the thalamus. Okay, it goes first to the thalamus. Remember, in the center of the brain, that walnut-shaped thing. Now, the thalamus is really important. It's in both of these pathways. And the thalamus is what creates the two pathways, because when the thalamus receives information, it sends it to two places at once. It sends it to the amygdala, and it sends it to the cortex. Now, it's really close to the amygdala, the thalamus is. So it gets to the amygdala first. And I just want to tell you a little something, like, to process visual information, the information has to go from the back of your eyeballs to the optic nerve, to the thalamus, and then the thalamus has to send it into the cortex, where it gets processed. Well, you know where visual information gets processed in your cortex? You know where it is? Back here. the back of your head. So the information has to go all the way to the back of your head, visual information to be processed. So the information gets to the amygdala before it gets to your the place in your cortex where it gets processed. Now, when it's processed in your cortex is when you see it or hear it or feel it. When it's processed in the amygdala sees and hears in its own way, you know, and it can respond to those sounds and sights and touch, right? But guess what? You don't see what the amygdala sees. You don't hear what the amygdala hears, but the amygdala sees and hears things before you do. And that is why when you are driving down the highway and you see something come into your lane, that sometimes you find yourself making a quick reaction before you even clearly see what's going on. And it's almost as if you weren't in control of, let's say you turned the wheel quickly, or let's say you hit the brake, or, you know, you could have been that you pushed the gas pedal and zoomed around the thing that just came into your lane ahead of you. How does that happen? See, because the amygdala can see before you see, and it can make a reaction occur that quickly. And that reaction, that defense reaction, where your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, and you may make movements, you may jump back, you know, you might hit someone, but in your car, you might turn the wheel or hit the brake or whatever you do. And you do that so quickly before, I'm telling you, before you can even see it, because the information takes a while to get back to the back part of your occipital lobes here in the cortex where you process it. So the amygdala pathway is a very quick pathway that's designed to help keep us safe by reacting to things we see or hear before we have been able to completely process them. All right, so that's one pathway, and it can produce this defense response. Now, the other pathway is the cortex pathway. So at the same time, the thalamus sends information on, it's kind of like receiving a telephone call and saying, okay, I'll connect you to the right person you need to speak to. It says you need to go to, like, this is auditory information, you need to go to the temporal lobe, or this is visual information to the back of the brain. It sends the information wherever it needs to go. At the same time, it sends it to the amygdala. It takes it a while to get there, but eventually you hear or see or feel information. Now, when you see or hear it, the amygdala has access to that information also, because the amygdala watches the cortex. If you notice, we got these little connections from the amygdala up into the cortex. That means, I like to say, it's kind of like the amygdala watches cortex television, right? So the amygdala sees what's going on in your cortex. It sees what you're experiencing. In other words, it knows that the car that came in to your lane is a blue car, and it actually can see that maybe it has a flat tire, or it could see who driving, it could hear the sounds that are going on. But the amygdala got quick and dirty, not all that detailed information, but it just saw something was coming, not all the details that your cortex can process. So here's what happens. Once the amygdala sees more information in the cortex, the amygdala might adjust its reaction. I think a good way to say that might be, like, let's say you have a friend come up to you in the grocery store, and you don't know this. You're standing there looking at bananas, and this person comes up and grabs your shoulder and is like, hey, Catherine, you know. And when that person grabs your shoulder and says, hey, Catherine, your amygdala processes that first and might process that as a dangerous kind of feeling. Someone's grabbing you. So you might like jump out of your skin, your heart is pounding, all that. But in just a fraction of a second more, you hear you feel and hear and turn around and see more information, which the amygdala then has access to. And what you see is this a friend of yours that just grabbed you on the shoulders, said, I haven't seen you in weeks. Where have you been? It's so good to see you. We got to get together. Do you still want to go kayaking sometime? You know? So then the amygdala gets that new information, and the amygdala will calm down. You see what I'm saying? So the amygdala pathway is this way. Sensory information coming into the thalamus. The amygdala pathway is then directly to the amygdala, and the amygdala makes a reaction to that information. It may be no reaction. Like right now, your amygdala is watching me and not doing anything, nothing, you know? The amygdala doesn't make a defense reaction. You're completely safe. There's no signs of danger or anything. All right. But where's the cortex pathway? Here's the cortex pathway. It starts from that sensory information coming in, goes to the thalamus, goes up to the cortex, then the amygdala processes the cortex information, and then the amygdala can put out a reaction, maybe a defense reaction, maybe nothing.